As we were growing up, we always realized that the love of the spirits business and the wine business was a romance story. It was a story about brands, it was a story about people, it was a story about places. And these are living things and living stories with people that just capture your imagination.
The early days of Young's, it goes back, we were cattle ranchers in LA.
Well, my grandfather started the business after World War II in 1946. And if there's one thing I think they would pass on is your word is your bond. Any of it, my grandfather, father, myself, or my kids, if they give you their word, you can take it to the bank.
We started in 1933 at the crack of Prohibition repeal. And we started in the basement of a grocery store.
In 1908, my great-grandfather bought into Weitzel and Company.
In 1959, I graduated high school, went to work at Shenley Industries in the Empire State Building as a gentleman who did mail.
My grandfather was one of the founders of the company. The company started prior to the end of Prohibition.
Our Industries was founded right after Prohibition. My father was working as an accountant, and two of his brother-in-laws, they were from, I guess you'd call it a wise guy crowd at the time. What happened before 1934, we don't talk about.
Well, my grandfather was a bootlegger during Prohibition. He didn't have a formal education, but he was very street smart. And in the early 1900s, that was definitely what it took to survive.
Bill Wirtz was a larger-than-life character. He lit up a room, he commanded presence, and I think that was very much the era of the leader and the head of the family to be like that.
I met many of the founders of what are today the giant companies that they've become, of Nolan Glazer or Herman Marinoff, and these people were visionaries. They were people who recognized the value of the service they were providing, and they built an industry.
My father-in-law, Ed Block, called me in December of 1965 and said, I think there's an opportunity. I think the wine business is going to be something one day. This was an opportunity of a lifetime. The right place at the right time with people who supported me. And as my father-in-law, Ed Block, said, you may fall further than you want, but I'll never let you hit the ground.
When I started in 1968, they called this meeting and the manager introduced me. He says, this is Buster Glazer, and each salesman in that room, we're going to give up the 5 accounts they didn't want. The worst accounts that you could ever imagine. I mean, that was the most unbelievable training experience I've ever had. I learned all about rejection.
My great-great-grandmother was a very austere, serious, hardworking woman. She ended up losing her husband at a very early age, and she ended up marrying the gentleman across the street in order to be able to keep her business.
My company started with my father-in-law in 1939, and he, like many who started the business, came through the Depression, and they had common characteristics. Tenacious and tough. They knew how to lead people and make things happen. And I always think about these people because if they messed up in the beginning, the party was over. If we mess up today, it's not quite as disastrous.
In 1978, I was 28 years old. I didn't have any money. And then my wife tells me she's pregnant with our first kid. We sold the house, moved into an apartment, and I took the money from the house that we had, and that was my down payment, and that's how I got started in general wine and liquor.
Well, I know in 1926, my grandfather was thinking, even though he was only 25 at the time, on how he could build a company and pass it on to future Wirtz generations, even though they hadn't been built. And so everything was set up with the idea of passing the business on from one generation to the next from day one.
My grandfather was that first generation. There was one way to do it. It was his way. And my father was a very bright man, had visions for the business, and they struggled.
Family-owned businesses, they're not entitlements, they're responsibilities, and you're not gifted them. So therefore you can't treat them like a gift.
It's not just us, our family, it's everyone we're associated with. We have almost 10,000 associates that work at Republic National Distributing Company, and we think of all of them as family. The longer they're with us, the more family they become.
I had the thrill of working with my father for decades, and now sort of the torch has been passed, and I have the thrill of working with my son, hopefully for many more decades as well.
When my dad called, I was a little taken aback, and he said, we're looking at some things here, and if there was ever a time that you wanted to come and join the family business, this would be a good time to do it. And I took that as the Lord's providence, that I happened to be home when he happened to have called. And I would say 3 months later, I had accepted the job and was going to work for him.
After the birth of my first son, back in 2004, I felt a sense of responsibility. I felt the timing was right, and I was excited to join the family business and join Republic National Distributing. I have 2 regrets about it, and one is that I didn't get to meet Ed Block, and the second regret is that I didn't join the family business earlier.
When I came into the business, I started on the bottom. I started working on the trucks.
I had the opportunity as a child to work in the business in the summers, so I did everything. I worked in the warehouse, I drove a tow motor, I drove a truck.
I was very young in the summers. I'd go to the office with my dad and climb around on the boxes and play in the warehouse. I've always worked there. And I always loved the business. To me, there was nothing greater than being in a family business.
Many of our employees have been there 10, 15, 20, 30 years. It's more than just growing a business. It is growing a legacy.
Think about all the jobs we've created. Think about the lives we've created. I've got kids of employees that now work for me. That's what makes me most proud.
There were a lot of people still in the industry that had come over when Prohibition was repealed, and they were the real characters of the industry. They had a lot of personality and a lot of gumption, and they made things very interesting. They had great stories.
You obviously feel a tremendous responsibility to continue the legacy.
I'm very humbled by our past. The fact that we've survived 5 generations, it's a lot of responsibility that I have, but it's tremendous history that I'm very proud of.
The greatest thing about a family business is that I know that my grandfather looks down on us today and is proud.
These are our stories. These are the stories of incredible families. They're stories about perseverance, grit, and determination. So in this, our 75th anniversary, let's take a moment to acknowledge those that had the vision to get us where we are today.